what I was going to try to do, which it maybe it's slightly ambitious, but was to try to talk about some fairly abstract technology development concepts and use the back pain case to illustrate them slightly. So I'm going to show a slide first of all. So this is a conversation I had this week, which is, I think, goes to Ashok's point earlier about conversations between different stakeholders and the extent to which they're bought in. But I would say this is a fairly common representation of discussions between hospitals, clinicians, and patients or innovators and the conversation goes something like this: patients have all this data, they need to get back in front of the GP, so they're sitting at home with their wearables, and there's all this stuff going on, and there's this massive gap between what the GP knows. What we need to do is just send it to the GP, and you say it's a wee bit more complicated than that. And one of the reasons it's a wee bit more complicated than that is I've worked, some experience of working in various studies with Trish Greenhalgh in the Department of Primary Care, where we looked at various kind of digital health interventions. And when you really interrogate them, if they're not workflowed well, they've not got the buy-in of the stakeholders, you get all sorts of false alarms, you get all sorts of safety errors, you get all sorts of additional safety issues. So you send a GP a whole heap of information. Essentially what you're sending a GP in that instance is a tidal wave of noise that they don't yet have the tools to process. And the response was, what do you mean GPs don't care about what is happening to a patient at home? And it's unfortunately just the case that the healthcare system is quite complicated. And that doesn't mean that it can't be changed even at gargantuan scale. It just requires quite kind of smart, I think, interrogative, often first principles thinking to think and understand various different stakeholders' issues and understand how you might get a solution that fits into those, solving those problems. And so the next two slides I want to show are just two different models, which I think contribute to some of the clash. So this is the kind of California tech model to some extent. So it may be familiar to some, less familiar to others. This is fairly common trope from, if you read any of the Silicon Valley tech books or the Medium articles or whatever. Essentially, you start out, you've got a hunch on a problem. You think that problem's maybe meaningful. I'll come back to it in a moment, but sometimes people find a problem and it's a local optimization and they haven't quite understood where the real problem is. You kind of go and do some research and you start to think about these concepts of desirability and feasibility. Desirability is kind of like, does somebody want that thing? If it existed, would they want it? Feasibility is a bit more like, could you actually do it? So you get to this notion of an MVP. The MVP would be a thing that somebody uses. And then you start iterating that thing. That point with the MVP might be called the problem solution fit. You don't have what would be called product market fit at that point because nobody's paying for it and it's not therefore scalable as a business. So to Ashok's point, if these are businesses, people need to pay for them or they don't work as businesses. And I think it's quite important to recognize that fact. If it's not a business, that's fine. But if it is a business, that is the underlying or the underlying drivers of the effectiveness in the long term of a business is their viability. So you get to problem solution fit, and then the next thing you do is these product iterations, testing with users, making the product a bit different, taking a bunch of feedback, and then at some point you've got a product that's useful enough that somebody would pay for it. So at that point you might say that you've nailed the problem of desirability, somebody wants it. You've nailed the problem of feasibility, you can build it, and you've nailed the problem of viability, somebody will pay for it. And at that point, you've got what might be called product market fit. In reality, what happens with products, if you think about products and different products displacing other products, is that essentially a company's running a series of iterative product market fit experiments. So you're perpetually trying to find product market fit, and it's really, really difficult. And then at that point, you might get runaway organic growth on that capability. But to stay viable in the market, you need to stay ahead of everybody. So you need to make your next widget, your next feature, or your next identify the next problem. So that pipeline is quite painful. I know it's painful because I have built a product that did this, which to investors looks magnificent. We eventually turned it off. So that was a kind of a growth curve of a thing with growth that eventually reached nearly 2 million patients. That was 2,000 clinician users. And the viability bit didn't work. So I have the painful experience of knowing what runaway growth of a product you eventually decide to deprecate, turn off, looks like. So again, back to Ashok's point, it's all very nice building something that's used a lot, but it has to have a business model behind it that works, or a model for which payment is received that makes it viable if there's some alternative not-for-profit structure. So that's one model. This is the kind of California tech model. And then the other model is this, which is the more traditional, what we might be used to in medicine, pharmaceutical development pipeline. This is what project managers might call waterfall in its outline. There's a series of steps that you take a product through. And once you've developed the product, you design lock it. So that first phase, you make it in a lab, you stop making the drug, you put it into the next phase, and then it moves through a series of trials. Now, even in pharma, people talk about EROM's law, the escalating cost of drugs, because in reality, what often happens is that process costs hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. And during the process, once you've kind of decided you're going to go with a thing, you're fairly locked into executing that through to readout, even if you might get interim results that suggest that you're not going to be able to, it's not likely to be a viable product in the market. And that's a very difficult decision, I'm sure, for pharmaceutical executives to make. But these two different models clash quite significantly when you get into healthcare, because you've got people trying to make usable products, and then you've got people trying to make products that demonstrably improve the quality and quantity of people's lives to the extent that they might be useful for a health system and therefore reimbursed. And that constellation of these two models, I don't think as yet anyone's expressed particularly well how you fit these two things to a compliant and regulated technology that is built iteratively and develops to scale. So if someone has a picture of those two things which meld together to show something elegant, I would love to see it, because it's painful trying to work it out. So I bring these two pictures up before then going to talk about those principles I was going to mention in regards to this back pain case. So again, there'll be a range of different people on the call. My background was really, I did medicine, and then I did a bit of wet lab stuff, and I did a bit of international development work that involved technology, but not business. And I probably didn't understand enough the different concepts of business. For example, things like whether it's a consumer business or a business to business business or a business to business to consumer business. But I think, again, that goes back to Ashok's critical point of the different stakeholders and their relative buy-in. Ultimately, healthcare is an ecosystem of actors, and you need to work out which actors you're going to be working with or trying to solve problems for. And then within that, understanding that there are different types of models that businesses are fairly familiar with. And I think I underestimated the importance of articulating these bits early, but, you know, apologies to the business people or even the medical people for whom this is fairly obvious, but, you know, a B2C business is a business to consumer business. So you might be able to build a business that's direct to a consumer, a patient, B2P maybe, a direct to patient application that doesn't have that additional actor of the healthcare system or the doctor or another healthcare worker. You might be able to build a B2B2C business. So that would be you selling something to, for example, a doctor that they use to do something with a patient, or a B2B business where you're just selling something to the doctor, like Ashok's dictaphone example. There are lots of other versions of this, like B2G, B2B2G, if you invoke a government stakeholder. Those things are really important because they drive a lot of the thinking. So when we think about the back pain example, the types of businesses that you could build for solving the problem that Dilraj was talking about, the extent of the involvement of the doctor or the healthcare worker or the hospital or healthcare system in the interventions that he's taken have a massive impact on the types of product that you would build. So I think really mapping out the ecosystem of stakeholders and then being quite realistic about which ones you do or don't want to invoke. So when you think about then problems, sometimes that the current model for pharmaceutical development is very, very specific. So it's a vertical intervention to solve a very concrete problem in a very clearly articulated market. Occasionally the indications might creep, but you're basically saying there are people with these inclusion and exclusion criteria that will benefit from this drug. NICE will decide whether it gets prescribed and how much it gets paid, reimbursed. We'll then prescribe the drug. Technology platforms often start with more abstract solutions. For example, communications can end up being quite a powerful cross-cutting tool upon which people can start to build other things. So for example, if you were to determine that you wanted to build an intervention that was for doctors to prescribe a very, very specific care pathway for back pain, what you'd probably quickly find, I think, is that doctors would say, I see, if it was a GP anyway, I see, 50 different types of things, of which back pain is one. And so this question of abstraction, in reality, what the doctor's got there is a communications problem, not a of which a derivative is the distribution of the information the doctor has in their head or NICE could put into their head that the doctor could give to the patient. So they've got communications issue, and the specific issue that manifests as a consequence of that is that Dilraj isn't really well communicated with in regards to, again, a number of abstract principles like whether or not he turns up to stuff, whether or not he knows about non-medical interventions like going to the physio, whether or not he takes medication that's given to him, whether or not that medication works. Again, those are abstractions. And solutions can therefore be generalizable or specific. So some of the most impactful things in tech have been quite generalizable. You don't go to different search engines to search for very specific things. You go to Google. Now, it's important not to conflate that with trying to do everything at once. So people will also talk about the concept of a beachhead. The trope for that would be probably the Facebook social network film, where they start with the people at Harvard and the Ivy League. What they did was, in some senses, miserably unhelpful business in my view, but what they did was model, again, in the abstract, what you could say is everybody's infinitely complicated social lives. So and distilled it down to the essence of what that was. That was probably some underlying deadly sins and liking stuff, posting stuff, activity feeds, and that abstraction enabled them to model the infinitely complicated social lives that we all lead. So again, taking that back to Dilraj's back pain case, it's important to solve a concrete problem for Dilraj in the context of understanding which stakeholders you want to invoke, and for that to be probably quite specific at first so that it can fix Dilraj's problem. But you could locally optimize and bury it into solving Dilraj and his problem only in a way that you couldn't generalize and scale. An example I might use sometimes to think about that would be the difference between Amazon Web Services and Netflix. So Amazon Web Services can essentially sit and watch what content lots of other people are producing. And as a consequence of that, they can start to learn what types of content they should produce and push that into their ecosystem. So again, if you thought of doctors' communications, if you are sitting in front of doctors and you're watching every communication that they want because you've built them a generalizable tool for communication, and you watch all of what they do, essentially they'll build your AI for you. Whereas if you build a very specific solution in that specific context that only works for one indication, what will very quickly happen is they'll forget about it because they'll move on to the next patient who has a different problem. And so that just takes to the point of consideration of scale versus depth. I think it's important when you're thinking about what you're doing.
Alexander, you have about a minute left.
Brilliant. I've three lines. So considering scale versus depth, this is just to say that if you're building a deep tech thing that's going to take 5 years to prove, know that you're doing that up front. Be explicit. If you're trying to build something which is getting lots of users, know that you're doing that. Thinking about how you enter the workflow of the stakeholders, again, really important, and not in a niche way. How would you really get that to scale across a workflow. And then the final point is just to think about the impact of compliance on the journey. So some people build the stuff that requires the least compliance early to build a user base, and then do the deeper compliance later. Other people will, the whole premise will be around compliance early. The importance of that is that the more compliance you put early on, the more difficult it is for a very small company to start. So thinking about how you sequence compliance in a journey towards solving problems for patients, I think is very important. So make sure you kind of understand who the stakeholders are and map them out. Think about the problem, the extent to which it's abstract or specific. Think about the solution, the extent to which it's generalizable or specific. Think early whether you're going for something which would scale quickly, or you're going for something that you're going to spend 5 years working out whether it works. How do you enter the workflow? And think about how you can mitigate the impact of compliance on the journey, whilst also maximizing the benefit of compliance for delivery of impact in the longer term. And also ultimately that can help, depending on the type of product, with reimbursement in the longer term. Thank you very much.